So, the federal budget deficit. We've all spent our whole lives hearing about it. This massive existential crisis bearing down on us as a country. It's usually presented in pretty simple terms. America spends more money than it collects in taxes, so it has to borrow to make up for the shortfall. And just like any household that spends beyond its means, this drives us deeper into debt the longer we keep doing it. But what does all this mean in practice? Did Barack Obama show up in Beijing, hat in hand, begging for Xi Jinping to help us out with our bills this year? Are they gonna repo all our aircraft carriers if we can't pay up? No, that's not how any of this works, and I think we all kinda know that. Deficit panic tends to be sold to voters with simple analogies about household debt. But if that were really how our leaders felt, would they repeatedly defend tax cuts and rising military spending? People on the left often rightfully point out this contradiction, but the problem is, while that might be a good way to point out political hypocrisy, it doesn't really help our case for more social welfare spending. In fact, it makes the deficit seem like an even bigger problem because our short-sighted politicians keep recklessly driving it higher. We need a better argument than that.
So what I want to do today is take a different tact. I want to dig into some of the concepts and ideas behind all this rhetoric and see if it really holds up to scrutiny. I'm going to be focusing on US politics, but for the record, a lot of what I'm saying will apply to any country with a central banking system and its own sovereign currency. I'm going to be focusing on US politics, but a lot of what I'll be saying applies to any country with a sovereign currency and a central banking system. For the record, I'm not an economist. My degree is in accounting. Nevertheless, I think I've got a pretty good grasp on this, and if you want to know more about my sources, check out the description. Alright, so let's start by talking about the national debt itself, what it is, and how it interacts with our economy.
People tend to present the national debt as if it's some kind of loan we took out from China.
The problem is that the way Bush has done it over the last 8 years is to take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt.
But the reality is that this is nothing like traditional credit. When the federal government spends more money than it collects in taxes, it issues treasury bonds. Treasury bonds, often just called treasuries, are tradable debt securities that the government auctions off to the private sector. Since the money used to purchase treasuries goes into the Federal Reserve, you could look at this as money being kept in sort of a holding pattern. So owning a treasury is sort of like having money in a savings account in the Federal Reserve. Now in theory, this is unnecessary. The government could just tax or print all the money it needs. The advantage of selling treasuries is that it acts as a counterweight to inflation, removing money from circulation while also driving up demand for the dollar. Not to mention it's less controversial than taxing. But it seems like a lot of our elected representatives don't understand this. In her 2020 book, The Deficit Myth, economist Stephanie Kelton describes her experience working as an advisor to the Senate Budget Committee. One of the most eye-opening things I learned came from a game I would play with members of the committee, or their staffers. I did this dozens of times, and I always got the same incredible reaction. I'd start by asking them to imagine that they had discovered a magic wand with the power to eliminate the entire national debt with one flick of the wrist. Then I'd ask, would you wave the wand? Without hesitation, they all wanted the debt gone. After establishing an unflinching desire to wipe the slate clean, I'd ask a seemingly different question. Suppose that wand had the power to rid the world of US treasuries. Would you wave it? The question drew puzzled looks, furrowed brows, and pensive expressions. Eventually, everyone would decide against waving the wand. She goes on to observe, they loved US treasuries as long as they thought of them as financial assets held by the private sector, but they hated the very same securities when they considered them obligations of the federal government. We see this contradiction in other places too. Some argue that China could weaponize their treasury holdings against us by selling off some or all of them, which theoretically could lower their demand and thus their value, meaning our interest payments would have to go up, causing inflation. There's a certain irony to the fact that this fear-mongering about China selling treasury holdings always seems to come from the same people who are worried about China buying them in the first place. The premise doesn't seem to hold up in the real world, though. In 2016, China sold off about 15% of their treasury holdings in just 4 months, and the value of our bonds was virtually unchanged. There's a simple reason why. The demand for US Treasury bonds didn't change. For every bond China sold, there was a buyer waiting. Funny how we always make China the villain of this story. Don't get me wrong, I'm not defending their government. They do some terrible things, but in this case, they're really just doing what makes financial sense. The US dollar is the world reserve currency. That essentially means that's in the position gold was back in the days of the gold standard. Other countries need to accumulate dollars to back up their own currency. And once you're hoarding dollars, you might as well invest them in treasury bonds. For the record, China is not funding the US government. According to data released by the US Treasury in May 2021, China owns about $1.1 trillion worth of our treasury bonds. That's about 3.6% of our total debt. The federal government owns about 22% of our debt. You might wonder why the government owes itself money. Basically, some federal programs have their own funding schemes that can sometimes result in them taking in more money than they plan on spending. So when, say, the Social Security Trust Fund has excess cash, they buy treasuries. The idea is that moves the cash into the general fund for use elsewhere while still making an equivalent investment in the intended program. But it's funny that when people fearmonger about how much the government owes, they never tell you that nearly a quarter of that is to ourselves. Let's talk a bit about how the politics of debt actually interact with our economy. In 1996, Frederick Thayer, a professor of public and international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, observed that every major economic depression in U.S. history has been preceded by a sustained period of debt reduction. Here's the data he was using. This might seem counterintuitive at first, but it makes sense if you think about it. Every government deficit creates a surplus in the private sector, since more money is being spent into the economy without being taxed out. Likewise, every government surplus creates a private sector deficit, as the government takes money out of the economy without spending as much in. So in a sense, there's no way to get rid of the deficit. We can only shift it onto the private sector. It really shouldn't surprise anyone that this process hurts our economic growth. Reflecting on the connection, Thayer wrote, "The tragic comedy of economics is easily displayed. If someone borrows money to build a brewery, the money is officially listed as investment in national income accounts. If government borrows money to build a bridge that is needed by the brewery, these funds are not listed as investment because the bridge is considered waste." To think that this sort of logic undergirds public policy is to experience pure fright. Economics, of course, is not the only discipline that fills the world with unsupportable myth, but it is among the leaders. Funnily enough, not long after Thayer's article, the US did make the first serious attempt to reduce the national debt since the Great Depression. The Clinton administration was very proud of this at the time, and many still consider it to be their greatest accomplishment. After establishing a fiscal surplus in the budget, the administration proudly announced that the United States was on track to pay off its entire debt by 2012. Interestingly enough, in 2011, NPR's Planet Money would use the Freedom of Information Act to obtain a secret White House report from 2000. The report in question is called Life After Debt and raises the potential problems with eliminating the national debt, of which there are several. The federal government uses the U.S. Treasury market for a lot of things. Mainly controlling interest rates, but as I've already touched on, they're also used in intragovernmental funds. Then there's the impact on the private economy to think about. Banks regularly buy up billions of dollars worth of treasuries just because it's a safe place to keep money. Foreign governments do the same for reasons I've already discussed. All this demand supports the value of our bonds, and thus our currency as well. This report was originally intended to be included in the official economic report of the president, but was deemed too speculative and too politically sensitive to release. Seems like they wanted to keep the narrative simple. Of course, there were experts at the time who were skeptical of the Clinton administration's approach. Wynne Godley was a prominent economist who would later become more famous for predicting the global financial crisis of 2008. In his 1999 report, 7 Unsustainable Processes, he criticizes the view that the budget surplus can be maintained without weakening the economy. The view taken here, which is built into the Keynesian model later deployed, is that the government's fiscal operations, through their impact on disposable income and expenditure, play a crucial role in determining the level and growth rate of total demand and output. The circumstances that have generated a budget surplus combined with falling unemployment are not only unusual but essentially temporary. No decision to spend a surplus can be taken without regard for the impact on aggregate demand. In any case, there may soon be no surplus to spend. What Godley is saying here is that the Clinton surplus was ultimately unsustainable. Remember, government surpluses create private sector deficits. You can't expect the economy to keep growing and creating more jobs when the government is removing more and more money. He seems to have been right. The federal budget moved back into deficit in January 2001, when the stock market bubble, which had been supporting consumer spending, burst. This triggered a recession. It was a relatively mild recession, but its effects amplified the more severe recession of 2007. By the way, that's not to take any blame off W. He's just less relevant to the point I'm making right now.
So to sum up, the national debt is just a tool for supporting the value of our currency, not to mention some other policy goals. It doesn't really matter how big it gets. But of course, your more economically savvy fiscal conservative might not frame their argument around the debt itself. They'll tell you that excessive government spending causes inflation. So now we've got to talk about what that actually is. So people argue a lot about inflation. What are the causes? What can be done about it? How bad a problem is it, and who does it hurt? Rather than get into those concepts directly, I want to step back and interrogate the concept a bit. I think most people's idea of inflation goes something like when the value of a single unit of currency goes down, which isn't exactly wrong, but I think it's misleading. Because, how do you know? Money doesn't have any empirically quantifiable value, and it's not like everyone came together and agreed the value should be lower. So maybe a better question is, how is inflation measured?
Well, inflation is a measurement of price changes over time, and it's determined through the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The CPI is a monthly measurement of prices, and it's computed by taking a weighted average of prices across different industries. Here's a breakdown of how that weighted average is determined. Now here's a graph showing price changes across different industries from 1998 to 2018. As you can see, prices across different industries can have wildly disparate patterns. This graph also tracks CPI, which is in the middle here naturally. Now, I have to ask, when you take such different trends and average them together into just one line, is that really a useful figure? Wouldn't it make more sense to look at these industries individually? Take housing. The increased financialization of the housing market through Airbnb and the rental industry, combined with good old-fashioned gentrification, are driving up prices in our urban centers where most of the jobs still are. Or we could look at healthcare, where markups on care have nearly doubled in the past 30 years. These kinds of rises have more to do with changes in general business practice than the money supply. But when inflation is calculated, the process washes away all context and we pretend that all those price changes were caused by overspending on the part of the federal government. Anyway, now that we have a better understanding of what inflation is, let's talk a bit about how our government deals with it. The Federal Reserve operates under what we call a dual mandate from Congress. Their job is to keep unemployment as low as possible while keeping inflation stable. These goals are considered inherently linked through what economists call the Phillips curve, which posits an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. Of course, when I say they're supposed to keep unemployment as low as possible, that might be a little misleading. See, there's this concept in economics called the NAIRU, or the non-accelerating inflationary rate of unemployment. Despite the intimidating acronym, it's a pretty easy concept to understand. You'll sometimes hear it referred to simply as the natural state of unemployment. Basically, the idea is that the economy needs a certain amount of people to be unemployed at any given time. Bear in mind we're using the typical government definition of unemployed here, as in people who are actively seeking work but haven't been able to find it. The theory goes that if unemployment falls below a certain rate, wages will grow too fast as businesses have to compete for more workers. This would cause prices to rise, which means wages have to rise more, and this process would just spiral off into skyrocketing inflation. Economists call this a wage price spiral, and if you've ever heard someone express concern about the economy overheating, this is probably what they meant. Bear that in mind the next time someone mentions the red-hot labor market. What they're saying, even if they haven't thought it through themselves, is that employers are having to offer higher wages to compete for a limited number of job applicants. So to sum up, the idea is that there need to be enough people who need jobs at any given time that employers don't face too much pressure to increase wages. Notice how this model kind of implicitly requires the existence of an underclass who need jobs too badly to collectively bargain for better pay. Now, how does the Fed know what the NAIRU is? The short answer is that they don't. They make estimates, although I think it would be just as fair to call them assumptions. Whether or not those assumptions were correct can only be determined after the fact. The Fed aims for an inflation rate of 2%. That's the amount considered healthy for a growing economy. Throughout the 2010s, the Fed undershot that target 7 times. In the past few years, some progressives in Congress have been drawing attention to that fact.
In early 2014, the Federal Reserve believed that the long-run unemployment rate was around 5.4%. In early 2018, it was estimated that this was now around 4.5%. Now the estimate is around 4.2%. What is the current unemployment rate today?
3.7%.
3.7%. So what we had previously thought of, perhaps as far back as 2014, as the long-run unemployment rate is around 5.4%. What we're currently experiencing is 3.7, lower than that estimate. But unemployment has fallen about 3 full points since 2014. But inflation is no higher today than it was 5 years ago. Given these facts, do you think it's possible that the Fed's estimates of the lowest sustainable unemployment rate may have been too high?
Absolutely.
So we overshot in what our long-run unemployment rate is.
I think we've learned, as you pointed out, that you can't identify, this is something you can't identify directly. I think we've learned that it's lower than we thought, substantially lower than we thought in the past.
And I've been seeing lately that economists are increasingly worried that the idea of a Phillips curve that links unemployment and inflation is no longer describing what is happening in today's economy. Have you been considering on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very much so. We spend a great deal of time on that. The connection between slack in the economy, or the level of unemployment, and inflation was very strong if you go back 50 years, and it's gotten weaker and weaker and weaker to the point where it's a faint heartbeat that you can hear now. It's still there. You can see it at state-level data and things like that. But I think we really have learned, though, that the economy can sustain much lower unemployment than we thought without troubling levels of inflation.
It's funny how clips like this are so different from the way economic debate takes place in mainstream media. You know what I mean. On cable news, when they bring on some economist who works for a politician or think tank, and they explain everything with simple if-then statements as if this is a solved science, their job is to project confidence and drum up support for a particular agenda. But when you hear from a person who's actually accountable for implementing policy, it becomes clear that we don't always understand what's happening in our economy, and the conventional wisdom is wrong all the time. Anyway, getting back to the NAIRU, let's think about how this policy affects regular working people. When the Fed detects a tightening labor market and rising wages, they respond by raising interest rates. This causes unemployment to rise and wages to stagnate. Remember, that's not a side effect, it's the intended result. This is all done in the name of lowering inflation. And whether it works in that regard or not, the downward pressure on wages and employment is real. When this is the policy, it really shouldn't surprise you that we've had 40 years of stagnating worker pay. Recent inflation has led to the Federal Reserve raising interest rates yet again. Because if inflation is too high, that can only mean unemployment is below the NAIRU.
Is the NARU even real? Because I'll tell you, for a field like economics, which prides itself on hard evidence and statistical data, it's a weirdly metaphysical concept. It's defined as the level of unemployment where inflation is constant, which has, of course, never happened. You can't see the NARU, you can't measure it, there's no formula for it, and apparently it changes all the time. The only evidence of its existence is retroactive. When inflation numbers are measured and it's lower than the Fed intended, we say that they overestimated the NARU. When inflation is higher than intended, we say that they underestimated the NARU. But that seems like circular logic. I mean, there are all kinds of things that affect inflation. Anything that affects the price of any good affects inflation. Why do we assume that any departure from expected prices must be because of our monetary policy? Who came up with all this?
Alright, I'm getting to him. If you look at the famous examples of hyperinflation, it doesn't take long to see they really don't apply to America and the modern world. After Germany lost World War I, they had massive amounts of gold-denominated debt forced on them, which meant they had to print marks to buy it at the same time that their actual productive capacity was devastated. That's what really causes hyperinflation, when everyone has money but there's not enough actual goods to go around. Does that sound like the problem people are having in the US? There are a lot of things that can cause inflation, not the least of which are expectations of it. It's common practice in business to increase your prices to keep up with expected inflation, which is understandable, but it also makes it seem a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Another possible reason a business might raise its prices could be, as far-fetched as this may sound, they might just want to make more money. That was the conclusion of Rakin Maboud, chief economist at the Groundwork Collaborative, who in response to recent inflation said, "The more sway megacorporations have over our economy, the more power they have to gouge customers, squeeze Main Street, and exploit workers. Addressing this crisis means recognizing these price increases for what they are. The result of deeply entrenched, concentrated corporate power that has systematically stripped down supply chains and created room for pandemic profiteers, as well as long-standing underinvestment in our economy." And this isn't just a fringe opinion. Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich made a similar point in a recent article for The Guardian where he calls for more aggressive antitrust laws. In the article, he points out how many companies raising their prices in response to inflation were already seeing soaring profits. There was nothing forcing them.
And this has to make you question the way we're taught to think about inflation. Our economic theory seems to operate on this assumption that prices can be treated as a mere mathematical output of the costs that went into them. It's like we've constructed an ideology where business interests can do no wrong, where the largest corporations can raise prices for their own benefit, then protect the value of their money by lowering the buying power of the poor. So, yeah, that's pretty much my beef with inflation. It's a bad metric used to sell bad narratives. Alright, so if you're still with me, you might be thinking, okay, so the size of the national debt doesn't matter, and inflation is a misleading number that often has little to do with government spending. So why have I heard a different story my whole life? Every politician and pundit on TV seems to talk about this stuff the same way. Do I really think that all of them are wrong and I'm right? Well, yeah, I do. But you still have to wonder how these ideas became so dominant in the first place. So to talk about that, we're going to have to go back in time a little bit.
Prior to the 1970s, macroeconomic theory was dominated by Keynesian thinking. Keynesianism taught that deficit spending was a perfectly valid tool for lowering unemployment. Deficit spending leads to a higher money supply, which leads to more private spending, which leads to more business, which leads to more jobs. Now, of course, it was well understood that this process increased the likelihood of inflation, but that was considered a manageable trade-off. In those days, labor was mostly protected from price increases by cost of living adjustments, which were negotiated into contracts by unions. Labor unions were a lot more powerful back then. One person who was unhappy with this arrangement was Milton Friedman, probably the most influential economist in modern history. Friedman had been one of the founding members of the Mont Pelerin Society, a radical group of economists who opposed FDR's New Deal and practically anything else they deemed government intervention in the free market. They argued for tax cuts, deregulation, and the privatization of most government functions. In the 50s, they weren't taken very seriously, but over the course of the 60s, they would gradually gain popularity among wealthy business owners, particularly on the political right. Friedman believed that all inflation was caused by changes in the money supply and nothing else.
Inflation is made in Washington because only Washington can create money. And any other attribution to other groups of inflation is wrong.
I could take you through the math he used to prove this, but it's really not relevant. The underlying idea is that a sufficiently free market is so efficient that any changes in price can only be the result of monetary policy. Personally, I think this idea is ridiculous, but I can see its appeal. You get to sidestep all the complexity of reality and just say that all price increases are caused by the government spending too much money. He built on this idea with his theory about the natural rate of unemployment, which would later be codified as the Nehru. This school of thought is broadly known as monetarism. In 1970, Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile on the platform of nationalizing large sectors of the economy. At this time, Chile was a rising economic power in the region, and the popularity of socialism there had the U.S. government worried. In recent years, the State Department had been sponsoring Chilean students to study free market economics at the University of Chicago with, Milton Friedman.
The University of Chicago had a joint arrangement with the Catholic University of Chile, under which a great many Chilean students came to the University of Chicago, were trained by us, and received PhDs.
In 1973, General Augusto Pinochet seized power from the democratically elected government in a CIA-backed coup, ending 40 years of peaceful democracy. Pinochet's regime was brutally repressive. I don't want to get into details here because, frankly, it's just disgusting. Suffice it to say their crimes against humanity were numerous and extensive, and the US government was deeply involved. But that's not what this video is about. Pinochet's economic advisors were the very same economists who were trained by Friedman, and they immediately started implementing his recommendations. They removed price controls, sold off state industries, suppressed unions, and adopted free trade policies. The next year, Chile's inflation rate was measured at 375%. With their economy in crisis, Pinochet's government sought advice from the man himself, who took a trip down to visit. Friedman's diagnosis was simple. The Chilean government was spending too much money. I mean, of course he thought that. That was basically his entire ideology. He recommended that the government cut its spending dramatically and suddenly across the board. He called this approach shock treatment, a term which would catch on in the field. Friedman's policies came at the expense of the poor. During this period, it was calculated that a family living on the average wage had to spend about 75% of its income on bread alone. That said, the drastic reduction of the money supply did seem to lower inflation rates, which fell to relatively normal levels by the start of the 80s. In January 1982, Friedman coined the phrase the miracle of Chile to refer to this effect, a term which is still used today. Anyway, that same year their economy collapsed. Oh, did I mention this guy got the Nobel Prize in Economics? Chile was only able to recover through massive government intervention in the economy, nationalizing many of the largest banks. This didn't stop Friedman from taking credit for their eventual return to democracy in 1990. Even with Pinochet gone, much of the economic restructuring that happened under his regime remains in place today, and modern Chileans don't seem to be very grateful for the miracle. Okay, so this has been a fun little digression, but let's get back to the 70s. Another important thing happened in 1973. A number of Middle Eastern countries created an embargo targeting the US and other countries which had supported Israel in recent conflicts. Oil prices had been falling for decades, even as demand grew, but in 6 months starting in 73, the price of a barrel of oil quadrupled. This spike in the price of energy raised costs for practically every industry in the world, raising prices across the board for consumers while also leading many companies to either go out of business or shed workers. So we had high inflation, high unemployment, and low economic growth all at the same time. Economists call this stagflation. It's a fairly rare phenomenon because high unemployment and slow economic growth normally leads to low inflation. In this case, I think it's fairly easy to see that the reason this broke established patterns is that the main inciting event was an external one. In the following years, demand for oil only grew, and in 1979, the market suffered another shock. Iran overthrew their US-backed government, spiking the price of oil from $14.85 a barrel to $39.50. As this price change worked its way through the supply chain, inflation reached a 30-year high. Rising inflation was the centerpiece of the 1980 elections. The Carter administration said it was transitory and blamed the events in the Middle East. Nevertheless, they agreed that the deficit had to be reduced and said the American people would have to make sacrifices. This was an easy vulnerability for the Reagan campaign to exploit.
He has then accused the people of living too well and that we must share in scarcity, we must sacrifice and get used to doing with less. We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well.
In Reagan's framing, the real Americans were hardworking, virtuous, and asked for nothing. Our spending problem was the result of fat cat bureaucrats and lazy inner-city welfare recipients who lived easy on the government dole while giving back nothing to society. This message absolutely killed with voters, and he would go on to win the election in a landslide. Meanwhile, in response to the inflation panic, Jimmy Carter had appointed Paul Volcker as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. Over the next few years, Volcker would essentially institute the Friedman Doctrine, fighting inflation by raising interest rates to restrict the money supply. This triggered a recession in 1980, but inflation did taper off over the next 4 years. Also, the unemployment rate climbed from 6% to about 11%, but remember, that's how this policy is intended to work. Meanwhile, the Reagan administration was cracking down on unions and making drastic cuts to social welfare spending. Under Reagan's presidency, poverty and homelessness surged, but the media at the time heaped praise on him and Volcker for stopping the world-ending inflation crisis. Did these guys really deserve the credit? I mean, their solutions didn't even fit the original idea. Reagan's administration didn't shrink the deficit, they exploded it with massive military spending and tax cuts. I'm sure high interest rates did have some effect on inflation, but isn't it also possible that the inflation was mostly just the result of transitory spikes in energy costs? It's not like the US was the only country to see price increases at the time. But the details didn't seem to matter. The consensus was in. Deficits are bad. Regulations are bad. Unions are bad. Reagan went on to win re-election in an even bigger landslide. Jesus Christ, America loved this guy. Since Reagan's time, his style of politics has become pervasive, not just on the right, but among Democrats too, who were eager to show that they took the deficit even more seriously. Like this guy.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government. And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time.
The Clinton administration would show us a Democratic Party more interested in free trade, budget cuts, and the war on drugs than supporting unions or the poor. The second Bush administration followed Reagan's model even more ambitiously. More tax cuts, deregulation, and foreign interventionism. The 2007 housing crisis and the subsequent bank bailouts still stand as a stark reminder of our system's hypocrisy in this era of deficit fear-mongering. Millions of people lost their homes while the government mobilized hundreds of billions of dollars to prop up the banks that caused the crisis, because they were considered too important to fail. The Obama administration promised change, but they differed more rhetorically than practically. Their signature healthcare bill did more to prop up insurance companies than to threaten their profits. More to the point of this video, they seem to agree with the dominant economic doctrine of the past 40 years, framing every issue around its budgetary consequences.
If we don't act, a rising tide of borrowing will damage our economy, costing us jobs, and risking our future prosperity by sticking our children with the bill.
I'm proposing some difficult cuts that, frankly, I wouldn't normally make if they weren't absolutely necessary, but they are. And the truth is, we're going to have to make some tough choices in order to put this country back on a more sustainable fiscal path.
They even brought back Paul Volcker to chair their Economic Recovery Advisory Board. As I touched on earlier, the Obama administration had a pattern of undershooting their inflation goal, which indicates that unemployment could have been lowered with more spending. Meanwhile, they did the usual routine of touting stock market figures to show what a great job they had done. One of Obama's signature fiscal policies was quantitative easing. That's when the government buys up large amounts of debt from private banks to lower their risk while adding to the money supply. The general consensus about quantitative easing is that it worked, but not as well as the administration had planned. It seems that banks were less interested in investing in small businesses than they were in using the money for buybacks and dividends to support their own stock prices. And bonuses, of course. Now, that money still went into the economy and supported spending, but it probably didn't do much to help the people who were really hurt by the housing crisis. Quantitative easing added about $4 trillion to the money supply, and I don't see why they couldn't have just given that money to people who lost their homes. Or spend it on some other kind of useful program that hires people. Instead, they gave it to the exact companies that caused the crisis. And all the while, the right reacted to every perceived social welfare program as the herald of economic doom, driving deficit panic to new levels of absurdity.
I'm prepping to protect my family from global chaos brought on by hyperinflation.
This is a great example of what's wrong with our political culture. There's such a taboo against any kind of direct program to help people, everything gets done through this ridiculous top-down approach. Politicians may have stopped using the term trickle-down economics, but they still seem to believe in it. And lest you think this was just an Obama policy, the Trump administration did their own round of quantitative easing in response to the pandemic. And they say bipartisanship is dead. The Biden administration is also doing it, so this might just be a permanent part of the system now. I don't even know what to say about Trump's economic rhetoric. It's a bunch of self-contradictory bullshit, but for all his perceived radicalism, he clearly has no real understanding or interest in these issues. When he actually got into office, his economic policies were just the status quo. So here we are, with yet another president who makes everything about the budget.
This week, my administration released new information that contains that we're on track to cut the federal deficit by another $1.5 trillion by the end of this fiscal year, the biggest decline in a single year ever in American history, and the biggest decline on top of us having a $350 billion drop in the deficit last year, my first year as president. We also learned that for the first time since 2016, the Treasury Department is planning to pay down the national debt issued to the public this quarter.
And of course, whatever amount his administration does want to spend will be too much for Congress, which will negotiate everything down even further. And it's not like that money's going to make any radical changes anyway. Anything resembling the kind of social welfare systems that supported our working class from the New Deal through the 70s is considered communism now. Since the 80s, real wages have been dropping consistently. Most workers these days can't afford to go to college or buy a house. And forget medical treatment. The American healthcare system drives people into life-ruining amounts of debt for perfectly treatable problems. And I can't help but wonder, was the economic crisis of the 70s really solved? Or did we just create new problems? Well, here's the bottom line of this whole rant. I don't think budget politics are based on a sound understanding of economic and monetary theory. I think it's a moral panic. And like most moral panics, it has its roots in cultural anxieties. The 1970s was a time of massive cultural change. The values of the sexual revolution were becoming more mainstream, and old taboos were dying. Women were entering the workforce in greater numbers than ever, raising questions about the traditional nuclear family. The Civil Rights Act had only just passed in 1968, and much of white America still wasn't happy about the idea of a rising black middle class moving into their neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the growth of the anti-war movement, combined with the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, left a lot of doubt about America's future on the world stage. Crime statistics were on the rise, which makes sense when you consider the war on drugs had just started. But when you combine that scary-sounding statistic with a lot of popular news about cults and serial killers and an increasingly violent and nihilistic Hollywood, it's easy to paint the picture that America was spiraling into moral oblivion. And on top of all that, all of these politicians were going around telling ordinary working people that they would have to sacrifice to pay off the government's debt. So it all lined up nicely with this narrative that inflation was spiraling out of control because of people irresponsibly wanting too much. Reagan was able to speak to all of these issues, directly or indirectly.
Well, balancing the budget is like protecting
You don't spend more than you take in, right?
No, it's like protecting your virtue. You have to learn to say no. Washington doesn't even know how many people are on welfare, how many cheaters are getting more than one check. It only knows how many checks it's sending out. Peace does not come from weakness or from retreat. It comes from the restoration of American military superiority. This rise in crime, this growth of a hardened criminal class, has partly been the result of misplaced government priorities and a misguided social philosophy.
One tactic Reagan used was to tell anecdotes about people who were supposedly abusing the system. He had one he told over and over again about a woman who was living in luxury without working through massive welfare fraud.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
The story wasn't even true. It was wildly exaggerated from a story of a woman who was being charged with fraud amounting to just $8,000. But for voters of the time, it painted a vivid picture of who the real problem in our economy was. The spikes in inflation may have provided the catalyst, and Friedman's ideas gave it justification, but when you listen to what Ronnie was saying, you can tell what narrative voters were really responding to. A story that paints the lower class of this country as a bunch of naughty, spoiled children who need to be disciplined. So they wanted to take their privileges away so the adults could figure out how to run the country. Reagan's economic ideology assured us that things would get even better for the hard-working Americans, the so-called moral majority, and if things didn't work out for you, that just means you were lazy and doing anything to help you would lead to the downfall of society. The beauty of it is that with this narrative, you don't need to know anything about economics or monetary theory. You can just say that the government spends too much money and everyone's entitled. And it sounds like an informed opinion, but it's not. It's just empty moralizing.
In the past half-century, we've witnessed a massive transfer of power from public hands to private. At best, we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. At worst, we've crippled our democracy for no rational reason. We've become so dedicated to the idea that free markets solve problems that a lot of people seem to want to give up even more power to banks and tech companies.
There are people who want to go back to the gold standard, or worse, replace it with cryptocurrency, which would just give us a monetary system even less susceptible to democratic control. At this point, it's starting to feel like a religion. "O sweet child, lean not upon thine own understanding." If you would simply prostrate yourself in humility before the economy, the almighty job creators shall bless thee with tidings of investment capital. And if you show ingratitude by arrogantly questioning their wisdom, then the invisible hand of the market is going to leave a lump of coal in your stocking.
We're all taught growing up that this has already been figured out for us, that this is just the way things work. But if you actually look into the ideas behind it, you find a mess of contradictions and contrivances. You find archaic assumptions that don't hold up in the modern world and probably weren't even that true to begin with. For what it's worth, there are economists pushing back against all this.
One of the most prominent being Stephanie Kelton, who I mentioned earlier. Her book, The Deficit Myth, was a big help in writing this. Kelton argues that the national debt differs so drastically from household debt that it shouldn't even be referred to as debt, but simply as part of our net money supply. It really doesn't matter how high it gets. Her and a growing number of experts are advocating for a new school of economic thinking called modern monetary theory, a term coined by economist Bill Mitchell, who's another great resource. These economists have been converging on the idea of a federal job guarantee as their primary policy recommendation. It's not as crazy an idea as it might sound. FDR first proposed it in his Economic Bill of Rights, which was never adopted.
A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation.
The idea is to create an economy where we determine constraints by the actual resources, labor, and externalities that go into pursuing our goals, rather than just trying to maintain the arbitrary value of our currency, where our collective labor could be put into the things we as a society think are important. So don't fall into the trap of thinking every economist thinks the same way about this stuff, just because you always hear the same narrative from cable news.
For the record, none of this is an argument against raising taxes on the super rich. There are many good reasons to do that. But it doesn't need to be a prerequisite for more social welfare spending, which should really be the top priority. When people say we need to raise taxes on the rich in order to pay for things like universal health care, they inadvertently perpetuate a sense of dependency on the upper class. Labor is the real source of value. And what we're ultimately capable of isn't limited by how much money we can get out of billionaires.
We definitely need some fresh economic thinking. Milton Friedman's ideas didn't catch on because of any evidence they led to a better world. It was because they created short-term bumps in the stock market that politicians could take credit for, and because it provides ideological justification for a world where some people can have more money than entire countries, while other people can't afford life-saving medication, where vital resources like housing become investment tools for the rich, driving them out of reach of the average worker. And through it all, we're expected to be grateful to billionaire oligarchs, the fabled job creators who, in their infinite wisdom and beneficence, have seen fit to let us make them rich. The fact that these kinds of views catch on is a testament to how many people still believe in outdated ideas of social Darwinism.
Recent months have brought news of rising inflation once again, which makes sense when you look at how the pandemic has affected global supply lines. We live in a world economy now where products are produced in one country with raw materials from another country and sold in a third country. What's really happening is that the cheap shipping costs that led to this system are rising again due to an external cause, much like in the 70s. And it's all made worse by the lack of competition in our consolidated corporate system. This clearly isn't the kind of wage price spiral Friedman was talking about, because if that were the case, we wouldn't have soaring corporate profits. Nevertheless, the inflation figures are seen by many as the economy overheating, and because of that, the Fed is raising interest rates again. And that worries me, because I don't know how much longer this country can afford to keep driving people into poverty just to keep the dollar stronger. It's like we've gotten so attached to this system that we treat the real-world consequences as less important than maintaining it. What this country and the world badly need right now is an economic system that values things in terms of actual resources, rather than one that treats all real-world concerns as secondary to supporting this outdated system. Because the economy should serve human needs, not the other way around. Democratic pundits often like to paint their candidate as the new FDR. It seems like the modern Dems really want to be associated with this guy, but I don't think they remember him very well. So I wanted to end this video by revisiting FDR's inauguration speech. Most people know it as the speech where he says this.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
It's widely considered to be one of the greatest speeches in American history, but not many people today seem to really understand the context. There's a reason he started it off by telling people not to be afraid. The nation was in crisis, and he was proposing radical, unprecedented action.
And yet our distress comes from no failure of substance. We are stricken by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered, because they believed and were not afraid, we have still much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. Primarily, this is because the rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure and have abdicated.
He goes on to say that the response needed is on par with what would be called for if the country was being invaded, and that if Congress wouldn't comply, he would seek out emergency powers to accomplish this. And he didn't mince words about what he wanted to do.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously. It can be accomplished in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our great natural resources.
Our current administration claims not to believe in Reaganomics, but they show no interest in doing anything about the decades of economic restructuring that happened under that ideology. America badly needs our leaders to meet this moment with a new way of thinking, and just not being Trump isn't going to cut it. We need to start grappling with the fact that for most people, things have been getting worse for a long time. Instead, we keep electing people who got to where they are by bragging about the economic growth of the 80s and 90s. Sooner or later, something has to give. So it looks like for now, we're all just waiting to see how much worse things can get. I'm tired of being told that government spending is stealing from our children. Because I think the people who stole from our children are the ones who gutted our educational and social welfare systems. And if they grow up in a second Gilded Age while rising sea levels cause the biggest refugee crisis in history, I don't want to be the one to tell them that happened because we didn't have enough pieces of paper with numbers on them to fix it. So the next time you say we need a better healthcare system and someone asks, how are you going to pay for it? Just tell them that money's not real.